Hello, and welcome to our webcast. We're glad you can join us for today's session, Navigate Change with Operating Policies and Procedures. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now I would like to turn the floor over to one of today's presenters to get us started. Tammy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Tammy Lohr, and I am a senior manager in our strategy and operations practice. And I typically work with organizations to help increase their efficiency, effectiveness, and regulatory compliance. As part of this work, we always want to evaluate how the current state of policies and procedures are supporting organizational operations and guiding employee actions. I'm joined today by both Chelsea and Annie Rose, who will also do a brief introduction.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm Chelsea Ritchie. I'm also a senior manager within our group. I focus a lot on internal audit and policy and procedure development. So, really honing in on the policy and procedure aspect of my career. I help organizations organize their policies and procedures, identify gaps within policies and procedures, and help develop comprehensive policies and procedures for their organizations. Annie Rose?
Hello, I am Annie Rose, and I'm also part of the strategy and operations consulting team. My areas of focus are really around organizational development, strategic planning, and governance initiatives. And I work primarily with not-for-profits, local government, tribal government organizations. So a lot of my work around policies and procedures focus on how can we ensure that our policies and procedures are really supporting some of the big picture strategic initiatives within an organization. So we wanted to say thank you so much to everyone who has joined us so far. This is fantastic to see. We're really looking forward to sharing a little bit more about how policies and procedures can help organizations when you're going through a period of change or flux. And we also wanted to share some of the best practices that we've seen around how to keep policies and procedures up to date and actually active in order to support your organization. So I'm going to hand it back to Tammy to kick us off with our first polling question of the morning.
Great, thanks, Annie Rose. So before we dive in today, we wanted to get a sense of where everyone is at with their organizational policies and procedures. So we wanted to open our first polling question where you can rate the comprehensiveness and usefulness of your policies and procedures, rating it whether or not they're very comprehensive and very useful, you have some useful policies and procedures, but you need more, or your policies and procedures are not comprehensive or are outdated. And I know that I have worked with organizations that really run the gamut of these three different levels of maturity with policies and procedures, looking at both organizations that have a lot of policies and procedures where we can often see where there might be gaps or practices have changed and they maybe have not been updated, or organizations that haven't looked at policies and procedures for 20 years and are suddenly in a position where they need to revamp them because of new leadership and because of new systems and all kinds of other changes that we'll talk about today. That's what I've been seeing. Chelsea and Annie Rose, what about you?
Yeah, Tammy, I see all different types of organizations, and I think that the majority, are kind of at a loss. They go, we might have something, but we don't use it anymore. And we know this is opening us up to risk, but we don't know what to do now. So, where do we even start? So I think that's, we're going to talk about that today, but I think that's something that I see a lot of.
Okay, great. It looks like most of us are sort of in the middle where we've got some policies and procedures, but we need some more. And so what we'll be doing today is helping share what we see as high-risk policy and procedure areas, especially coming out of the pandemic, and understanding our post-pandemic world, if we can call it that yet. Unsure about that at this point in time. And also thinking about just the ways that organization and operations have changed as a result of a variety of different things over the last 2.5 years.
All right, so going into the key takeaways for this presentation, we will be discussing, operational policy and procedure areas that are really critical in turbulent times, such as, coming out of a pandemic, major management shifts and whatnot. We'll talk about proven methods to efficiently inventory, prioritize, and update those policies throughout the organization. And then we'll end with talking about some best practices for implementing and maintaining policies and procedures. And with that, we are going to go into our second polling question. Two polling questions, within the first 5 minutes. So what topic area are you most interested? Going over those 3 bullet points that I just discussed. Are you really interested in those high-risk policy and procedure areas that we've seen? Going through inventorying those policies and procedures? Or would you really like to hear more about maintaining policies and procedures? So 3, very different topics, but all very important. Annie Rose, when you look at, what you see throughout, what do you usually see that organizations are most interested in?
Well, right now, pretty much every team I'm working with doesn't have a lot of capacity. Everyone is putting out fires, they're running around, they're doing a lot of things. And so I think the high-risk policy and procedure areas have become even more important, because if you do have limited bandwidth, these are the ones to focus on during this time. So I think that a lot of the conversations I'm having really focus in that area. How about Tammy? What are you seeing here?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of organizations that have really struggled to maintain their policies over the last 2.5 years because things have shifted so much. And so again, with limited capacity, with a lot of changing processes, changing roles and responsibilities, those policies and procedures that might have been in place in 2019 are just not reflective of current practices anymore.
Ooh, there we go. So, looking at the results a lot, Annie Rose, I think a lot of people are feeling the same thing that you are, and, really interested in learning about those high-risk policies and procedures, and what are key areas that need to be covered in those policies and procedures, which is great because we'll be talking about that.
Great. So before we jump into some of those high-risk areas, we wanted to do a little bit of background around just why are we talking about policies and procedures right now? Why do they matter at this particular moment in time? And I'm assuming if you have joined this call, you must be interested in policies and procedures from some perspective. But we know that this topic can be really, really hard to sell sometimes across an organization. Like sometimes it can just feel like this is an administrative task, this is a checkbox activity, it doesn't really matter that much. So we wanted to share a little bit more about some of the value that a lot of the organizations that we work are seeing with their policies and procedures and some of the trends in terms of how this is showing up across public and social sectors. So thinking about this value, in the last 4 years, we're sort of grouping 4 different areas here where we've seen really significant shifts in many of our clients. And the first is just around general organizational change. For some folks, there's had to be complete shift in the service model, how you're providing services. Some organizations have had to shift strategy to figure out, okay, the needs that we're trying to fulfill here have changed. How are we going to meet those? There's other organizations where you might be dealing with either a huge influx of grant funding or cash or financial resources, and others that have been just squeaking by on a shoestring because they've seen a really big dip in their revenue sources. So all of those things obviously lead to organizational change and flux and shifts. And what that can produce is just a lack of consistent internal processes. It's really easy to lose that consistency when there's a lot of change going on. And then that's coupled with the fact that when there are a lot of shifts happening, employees are often looking for some level of stability, for some level of reassurance, especially when there might be many, many things outside of their control. What are some of the things that are inside their control? And policies and procedures can really help set that consistent process and standard for people. We're also seeing impacts of the Great Resignation when we're having a lot of folks leaving organizations or retiring out of organizations, and this need to be thinking proactively about how are we preparing our organizations for major staffing shifts and turnover. And when you do see a lot of turnover happening, that there's 2 pieces of that. One, if you have especially veterans who are leaving the organization and they're leaving with a ton of institutional knowledge, you want to make sure that that's captured and documented before they walk out the door, and that's just lost to the organization. And then on the flip side, as you're bringing new people into the organization, policies and procedures can be really critical as part of the onboarding process and the training process to really be establishing those norms, and then helping your current staff just up level in terms of their knowledge and their understanding of the expectations for how things should be working. The third one we have here is, I think, everyone's favorite, remote work. It's really changed up a lot of different areas, but one of the things that we're seeing is if there is a shift where your organization is now primarily remote work or even in a hybrid setting, folks who are working remotely often receive a lot less communication around what are the working norms, what are those standard processes. And so having documentation there can be really helpful, both to make sure that they're following them consistently, but also that they're feeling connected and engaged with the organization, because they're going to feel supported if there is documentation to help guide and navigate their path. And then the last one here, I know, Tammy, you're going to talk a little bit about fraud in a minute here, but distracted leadership. This is something we're seeing where leadership is necessarily having to focus on potentially responding to crises or some of these big picture shifts and changes. And that just creates opportunity for non-compliance and fraud if you don't have that oversight, and if you don't have a policy or procedure that really lists out who is meant to be providing that oversight function. So these are just some of the areas that we're seeing this come up very frequently. And kind of to recap, value of policies and procedures at the highest level. They establish norms and consistent processes. And in doing so, they really support that organizational continuity and stability within an organization to the degree that you can make that happen. They also facilitate clear communication of expectations. I really like talking about how policies and procedures, when you actually have to document something, it makes the implicit assumptions explicit. It forces some of those conversations, and that can be really, really helpful. I heard a phrase the other day that said, you can't manage a secret. And I thought that was so interesting, because it's true, like you can't manage to expectations if you haven't documented what those expectations actually are and gotten alignment around this is our organization's strategy here, processes here, safeguards here. So those are just a few of the big picture pieces. And now I'd love to turn it over to Chelsea just to ask, what are you seeing in the last few years around how policies and procedures are changing? What have you seen in your space?
Oops. Thanks, Tammy, or thanks, Annie Rose. Sorry about that. So what are we seeing in the marketplace? Organizations are rethinking their manual processes. I think we're all clear, both Tammy, Annie Rose, and myself are all working from home right now. So we're not in the office, not able to do those manual processes that maybe back in 2019 were kind of the norm that we had been doing in the past. System access levels and authorities are being changed. With changing management, changing philosophies, I think also we're seeing a lot more money influx in some organizations. So that's going to shift system access levels. I have seen many organizations where the CEO wants to see everything over $500. And so, stopping and thinking, is that really necessary? What kind of shifts can we make in this area? Email is being used to document approvals. We see this a lot. So we don't have that, in-depth technology to help us create a workflow within a process. Going to go off that PO again and just saying, yeah, supervisor says, yep, good to go. Is that really appropriate? P cards are being used more regular and for larger purchases. Back in the past, this was, something that we wouldn't use as much, and we might use a PO or something like that for larger purchases. But because of the change in where we are, where we're working, sometimes P cards are being used more regularly. Miscellaneous vendor accounts are being established. This can kind of get us in trouble sometimes. We're still moving at that fast pace back that we were in 2019. We don't have time to put everyone in the system. So just miscellaneous. What are the ramifications and procedures for something like that? And I think I mentioned this earlier, going back to grant funding. So a ton of my clients I'm seeing right now are getting grant funding, and that could be CARES or ARPA funds. So what does what is their responsibility? And my goodness, we've never heard of a single audit before. Some of these organizations are telling me, and now I'm going to have a single audit because of all this grant fund that I have received. What ramifications does that mean? Do I have to have policies and procedures? And the answer is yes. Auditors are going to be looking at those policies and procedures. So I think just to recap, going over all these different bullets, policies and procedures are more important than ever right now. And I think that we're going to continue this trend, especially with how we're going to see things changing, even after the pandemic. Tammy, I'm going to hand it to you.
Great. Along with all of those changes that Chelsea just mentioned, we wanted to also note the evolution of fraud risks that have occurred over the last 2.5 years. So we've had a pandemic, we had remote work, we might have hybrid work, we have the Great Resignation with worker shortages and changes, and all of those factors have contributed to changes in how organizations are operating and their risk of fraudulent activity. So I want to talk about some examples that have been coming up and could have been mitigated through effective policies and procedures. And the first area Chelsea had actually alluded to, which is related to the vendor confirmation process. So typically when a vendor wants to change their payment information, organizations will have a multi-step verification process that involves at least 2 people within their organization and someone at the vendor. So a request for a new vendor or a change of payment information would come in. That person who receives that request would call the vendor, verify the information, process the change, and then it would go to someone else for approval before any payments could be made using that information. But what we've seen is that vendors weren't always able to be reached, especially using the phone number that might show up on Google because people weren't in the office, or maybe your representative for that vendor was out on leave. And so those processes changed, and the ability to validate payment information, especially for time-sensitive purchases, was reduced. And unfortunately, there were a lot of fraudsters taking advantage of this by posing as a well-known vendor to change payment information and essentially siphon payments that should have been made for an approved vendor over to them instead. A lot of these instances made the news. I'm sure you could find several articles on them, but really this was due to disruption in the way that we operate, validate information, and really changing our processes in a way that didn't effectively protect our organization's assets. We've also seen an evolution in cybersecurity risks, so that's not a new risk by any stretch of the imagination, but we do need to acknowledge that we're using our systems more and more, and scammers have taken notice. They've been targeting organizations for data, and they've been far more effective in disrupting operations through ransomware attacks. And as we rely on our systems to be able to perform services, to do the work that we need to do, those ransomware attacks have become more impactful. An example of this is that a number of colleges that were offering remote learning were completely blocked from their systems for days or weeks until they could resolve a ransomware attack, which ultimately led to delays in being able to start classes and deliver their services to students. And that really should tie into thinking about the crisis policies and procedures in any organization and understanding where those cybersecurity risks can impact your operations. With respect to employee ethics, Annie Rose had alluded to this a little bit earlier, but we've got a couple things happening. First, we have existing employees who may be taking advantage of their position because they could feel disconnected from their employer, they could feel burnout, and we also have new employees that may have only ever been remote, that have never been in the office, never met their teammates in real life. And so what we have is different sets of potential ethical environments that have been created. And it's really been a change in how we monitor employee ethics and try to build those connections and trust with employees to support ethical behavior when we have different forms of oversight that have taken place as we transition into remote and hybrid work. Of course, the internal control environment has changed a lot. Chelsea went over that in pretty great detail in the last slide. There's been a lot of shifts in people and processes, including those oversight mechanisms. And the question that we have here is whether the shifts that have taken place have been evaluated for internal controls and documented to create consistency and accountability to follow those new processes. A great example that Chelsea also had talked about is thinking about people who are shifting their roles. If they've moved from one role into a different role, do they have the right system access and permissions for their new role? And more importantly, have their old permissions been revoked to help maintain segregation of duties? When workloads are really high, it's very easy for those little things to just fall through the cracks. And we've got to make sure that we're catching them to protect our organization and our people. And with that, we're going to start talking about some high-risk policy and procedure areas.
Great. So now that we've talked a little bit about the why behind why are we interested in policies and procedures, we want to dig into these high-risk areas, as Tammy said. And these, as we mentioned at the top of the hour, these are the areas where if your team has limited bandwidth, you're going to be getting the most bang for your buck by focusing in these areas. These are policy topics where a lot of our clients are either they have run into issues or challenges, or they're seeing a lot of benefits from having up-to-date policies and having that communication with their employees. So there are 4 areas that we'll go through: purchasing and procurement as one, grant management as one, if that's applicable to your organization, personnel policies, and then finally crisis management. So I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea to kick us off with purchasing and procurement.
Thanks, Annie Rose. And, I think it's also important, that we're looking at these 4, but my goodness, when I think about other high-risk areas, I also think of IT. These are not solely just the 4 high-risk areas. These are just the ones that we wanted to highlight today. So going over purchasing policies and procedures, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but this is a big one. And this is especially important if you're going to be having a single audit in the near future. So going over those bidding processes, really having due diligence thresholds, and this also is including for those verbal quotes as well. So verbal online quotes. How do you have formal written quotes? What about an RFP? What goes into that? And then making sure that you have dollar thresholds for each level of those due diligence levels. Vendor verification, I think we've hit this one on the head multiple times, but what are the steps to make sure that a vendor is, one, that you can use them, and two, that we have the correct information, and there's not going to have this fraudulent line that goes around this. Another thing that I always really like to highlight when we talk about vendor verification is, suspension and debarment. So what is your threshold for when you're looking at suspension and debarment checks? How is that information documented and stored? You want to make sure that you have that information readily available to auditors, or, just for your well-being. Contract management. So we get a contract, yay. So what happens next? Who is responsible, a responsible party for that management? Who's going to be looking to make sure that we're following, that, we're getting everything that we asked for and whatnot? Is there something unallowable that we're receiving that we shouldn't be receiving? Really making sure that you have that information. Also, a really important thing, when I think of contract management, to even kind of dive further, is that receiving of information, or of purchases as well. So you want to make sure that, purchasing policies and procedures have segregation of duties. We want to make sure that the person who bought the item is also not the person who is receiving the item, that there's some type of segregation of duty within this area. And I think that is a huge thing, being a past external auditor, and doing this in my career now, that I'm always looking out for, making sure that there's appropriate segregation of duties, even for small organizations. And, how can we help mitigate if there's only 3 of us in the accounting department? What are we going to do? Another really big one to look at when you're thinking about purchasing policies and procedures is change order approvals. There's going to be things that happen, and we're going to need to have a change order. And, believe it or not, sometimes there's not solid procedures on what individuals need to do in order to get this change order approved. So, is this going to be a completely new purchase order? Or are we going to modify the purchase order? This also opens up a lot of area for risk, especially in fraud. A mad employer, whatnot, could really, if we don't have solid procedures in this area, they could really help, or really, get their hands dirty. And then payment processing. So we've received the information, or received the box of whatever, and so now, what happens? How do we get that payment in order? Who do we send it to? Do we send it to AP office, or is there a certain individual that's responsible for, in the AP for vendors of A through M, whatnot? So really making sure that, you have these areas covered. And then the other important aspect of this is training your employees. So making sure that they understand exactly what they're supposed to do, have that room for opening up questions. Then you can hold them reliable to make sure that this follows through. The next one I'm going to discuss is grant policies and procedures. And I think this one is, relatively new for a lot of organizations, for both reasons. We're seeing a lot of more organizations writing grants or helping become the sub-monetary of grants, as well as receiving grants, right? I have a lot of tribal clients that never had received as much money as they did during COVID. And as great as that was, they needed to have proper policies and procedures in place to make sure that they follow through with those grants. So looking at, some major points of things that need to be in your policy and procedure. So, if this applies to you, grant proposals, also applications. who's going to be, searching for applications, grants that we can apply for. One that can be kind of complicated is your indirect cost proposals and agreements. Grant awarding and contracting. So we got a grant, great. Now what do we do with it? And they're really, believe it or not, there's going to be a lot of documentation that goes along with that grant award. And that goes right into the grant compliance monitoring. So, this really is, I think, a key aspect, because you want to make sure that you identified people responsible for that compliance, the reporting, and documentation. We are so fortunate to get these grants, but you could lose them so quickly if these three aspects are not properly in place. Cost reimbursement versus forward funded grant procedures. What exactly how do we get this money? Is it going to be, right off the bat, or do we have to go through different, milestones throughout the grant to receive this information? So these are things that, you want to look out for when you're, when you have received a grant, or when you're, going through the proposal. But we also need to make sure that, my goodness, we're making sure that we have this information available. Grant closeout as well. So the grant closes out. Unfortunately, we're not done yet. We have to keep this grant for a certain amount of time, and there's stuff that we have to have document retention for. So making sure all of this stuff is identified throughout your policy is so important. And then lastly, the CEPA preparation. So this would only apply to organizations that are going to be having a single audit. So, making sure who is going to be doing that CEPA preparation. And, usually that's going to be someone identified in your finance department. And then really making sure that we understand what is a grant receivable on our books, and then the deferred revenue tracking. So making sure that those individuals are, identified early on will be successful to making sure that the single audit process really is something that we can, move forward through easily. With that, I'm going to pass this on to Tammy.
Great. I am very excited to talk to everyone today about personnel policies and procedures. I find that these often fall into the bucket of, well, this is the way that we have always done it. And it is really a great moment right now to think about how we need to revamp these policies and procedures, given the significant changes in our operations and our external environment, including renewed energy towards diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, Great Resignation. How are we retaining individuals? How are we recruiting for really critical positions? And so we want to really encourage everyone to consider how your personnel policies are reflecting your organization's values and goals. Right now, employers are competing for a very limited number of employees. And what we're seeing is that employees are drawn to organizations by three things. The first being the employer's value proposition, the second being work-life flexibility, and of course, compensation. And so I want to talk a little bit about each one of these and how policies and procedures can help your organization in these three areas to really show that you're an employer of choice. The first area is the value proposition. So that's thinking about what is the work that we're doing and how are we doing it? How are we supporting and demonstrating our organizational values through commitment to things like sustainability or diversity, equity, and inclusion? And those should really flow throughout all of our personnel policies and procedures, including the way that we go about hiring, the way that we're working together, the way that we support our employees and enable professional growth and promotional opportunities. I also want to talk about work-life flexibility. Over the last 2.5 years, employers have really had to understand that their employees have obligations outside of work, and that has certainly changed the way that employees expect work-life flexibility to show up in their jobs. we've had employees go out on leave. We've had employees that were unable to come into the office because of their own medical issues or medical issues with those that are in the same household as them. And we've had to accommodate what works best for those employees. So right now, candidates are really thinking about what level of autonomy would I have in planning and executing my work so it fits within my lifestyle and my other obligations. And as Annie Rose alluded to earlier, it's really important to think about how we as organizations are making those decisions, and more importantly, who is making these decisions, because that can also have an equity impact if you have one manager who's making a decision for their employee about work-life balance and flexibility, and then you have another manager who has perhaps more traditional values about where you should be between the hours of 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And so it's really thinking about how you want to shape your organizational culture and what are your expectations for everyone across your organization, again, to make sure that we're supporting all employees equally. The last area that I want to talk about is compensation. Earlier this week, it came out that inflation was at 8.3% over the last 12 months, which, by the way, is a decrease since last month, but that is still incredibly high. And we do need to consider how we're paying our employees, including both those that are new in order to recruit talent and fill those critical positions that have been open, as well as those employees who have stayed with our organization. And this is really important as we've seen growing compression issues as organizations continue to hire new employees at higher pay rates, but existing employees may not have received the same compensation increases as they could have if they had left the organization. So really it's thinking about how are we dealing with and managing internal compression? Do we have a strategy? Do we have guidance? Is there information that we can share with our employees to encourage retention? And that really goes back to thinking about compensation related policies and procedures. So the areas shown here on the slide are all areas that we as organizations can influence through our personnel policies and procedures that we should be thinking about through our organizational shifts and changes. And we should be communicating our expectations around these internally and externally. Job candidates are paying attention, so we need to show how our work environment supports our employees and institutionalize those expectations. We have also learned over the last 2.5 years that you absolutely cannot succeed without your people. And so this is a great time as we're dealing with the Great Resignation to really be thinking about our personnel policies and procedures. I'm going to turn it to Annie Rose to talk about crisis communications.
Great, thank you so much. So crisis response, this could cover so many different areas, and we only have a couple listed here, but these are the ones that we're seeing a lot of our clients revisiting and re-engaging in most recently. So the first one I have listed is sick leave and coverage, which ultimately this really is a personnel policy, but I have it listed here because I think it's important when you're reviewing those types of policies to also bring the strategic lens to it so that you're answering questions like, what would happen if 30% or 50% of our leadership team was out with COVID, right? Like that's a very different type of issue than just what is our standard process going to be around things like testing or quarantine requirements or paid sick leave. So I wanted to highlight that one just to think from that strategic perspective, how are we thinking about sick leave and coverage when it comes to ensuring the continuity of our organization and the continuity of our management or leadership teams as well. We have emergency response listed here. You probably have some type of emergency response plan related to natural disasters or active shooter situations or those types of things. What we're seeing is that a lot of those policies might be out of date if you've really changed how you're using the physical spaces of your organization. If you've seen a major shift, for example, to remote work and there's only 5 people in the building usually, how does that change what your emergency response plan should actually be? Vice versa, if you've gone through a major hiring bump and you have a lot more people in your space, What does that mean? What does that look like? I also want to put a bit of a plug in here. If it's been a while since you have reviewed your emergency response and management policies, plans, processes, this is a great time to look at it through an accessibility lens as well and say, are these policies and procedures and plans actually taking into account people with disabilities or people with accessibility needs? So I just want to put that one out there because I think it's a great time, if you are already doing that step back, to be bringing some of these additional lenses to this area of work. And then the last one I wanted to talk about was crisis communications. So this is both thinking about what are our policies in terms of internal communications within the organization when something major happens, but also our external communication, our media policies, PR policies, those types of things. And this is obviously very important if you're responding to an actual physical emergency, but also if you're responding to a PR or reputational risk emergency. You really want to make sure that you have, for example, a very clear chain of communication. Who is speaking on behalf of the organization? That you have a single point person that is designated for that work. And then you have a backup person in case that person is out on vacation or out on sick leave when this actually happens. You want to be thinking about things like your social media policies as well. One of the things that has been really interesting actually is that for some of our clients in the past couple of years, their area of work may have become more polarized in terms of the discussions around it. So I'm thinking, for example, we work with a large healthcare foundation, and their area of work pre-pandemic was pretty neutral, didn't receive a lot of community pushback or flack. And then in the middle of COVID, in the middle of a pandemic, they've suddenly become highly politicized. There's a lot of division and polarization around beliefs around their work and what they should be doing as an organization. And so they've been on the receiving end of really heightened media scrutiny, a lot more feedback and pushback on social media platforms, and having to be just much more active in this space in a way that they never really had to before. So if you find yourself, you might be in a similar position, this is when those crisis communications, internal, external communications policies can be so important, both so that you're setting your staff up for success, that you're not, giving them the go-ahead to just go out and talk to the media, but also so that you're protecting your organization against risk as well. And I think, we're not going to talk too much about this today, but I think with all of these policies and procedures, a key factor of it is, have you actually trained your employees and your staff and your leadership team on how to use these policies? Do they actually know what's in them? And so I think especially crisis response is so important that you really ensure that there is appropriate training and distribution of these types of policies so that, again, you can be protecting people in health and safety situations or in reputational risk situations as well. So, finally, I did want to mention, we could have also listed IT, cybersecurity, and disaster recovery and continuity as a topic on this list as well, but it's such a big topic that we're actually going to leave that for a fully separate webinar because it's so many different areas to cover there. But that's another one where we're seeing a lot of folks looking at their policies and making changes as well. So then I'm going to move us into our third CPE question here. Please put in the chat box if you have any issue getting this poll up. But I'm curious, going over the 4 policy areas that we just did, I'm curious to hear from this group, which policy and procedure area in your organization do you think needs the most work? Is it the purchasing procurement side of things, grant management, personnel, or crisis management? And I would say that for myself, a lot of the most recent work I've been seeing has really focused on purchasing and personnel. But I'm curious, Chelsea and Tammy, starting with you, Chelsea, what are you seeing as the area that most people are focusing on currently?
It's funny, Annie Rose, because I was thinking just now, and I was looking at the questions. I wish there was an option E, and that says other. I know Mark Hoover had mentioned, he said, why isn't cash management on the high risk list? And I agree, it really does depend on an organization, what's material for the organization and what is their risky items. Being the accounting nerd that I am, I think, I see a lot in procurement. This is a big area right now. And I think it's with the new way of how organizations are shifting, being a lot more remote, I see that our segregation of duties need to change. Tammy?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about personnel, and so I'm potentially a little bit overly focused on personnel since I do a lot of work with HR departments. But I think the Great Resignation has had such an impact on organizations and their ability to do work that a lot of organizations are seeing that. And I see that that is reflected within this poll, actually, that personnel policies and procedures, it's a really important time to really think about how those are serving our organization.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see that we have almost an even split across these topics, because I think, when looking at them very broadly, this is about money flowing out of an organization, money flowing into an organization, our people, and how we're handling major crises, right? So that does cover some of the most critical pieces here. So that's really interesting to see this split. Okay, I'm going to turn this back over. I know we only have a few minutes left here until 10:50, but we wanted to spend the last bit here talking about implementation and maintenance best practices.
That's right. So, we have discussed some 4 of the high-risk areas that, the 3 of us have identified throughout the marketplace. But now what? So, we've identified those. So how do we implement those? How do we maintain those to really best fit our organization? So, keeping policies and procedures alive, I think that this is such an important slide. Because policies and procedures are constantly evolving. The worst thing that you can do is, come up with this great policy and procedure, put all your time and effort and into this policy, and then it just sits there and nobody is looking at it. And, a couple years go by, but my goodness, we do have that purchasing policy and procedure, but do we use it? So really, this is an ongoing thing, right? So the first thing is developing that policies and procedure. So, working with key, management teammates, and also key employees who are in the crux of, the procurement process. And then making sure that everybody is actually agreeing with this information. So, I think this is a really good time to make sure that, the employees think this is actually doable. And, as management, we can say, oh yeah, this is how it should go. But if we stop and say, hey, employees, is this something that we can really do is so important. Showing that we have this strong implementation to withhold these standards is so important to making sure that policies and procedures are really, utilized through your organization. So once that agreement has been made, implementation, and implementation just isn't, hitting send, look at the newest policy and procedure that we, provided, but it's really making sure that there's proper training in place. This is not a surprise to employees, that everyone is in agreement that this is something that should be done. And then monitoring and reviewing them. I say best practice, having, somebody look at the policies and procedures at least once a year. Software changes, different people come and go. So making sure, is this something that's still really, is applicable to our organization. And then, obviously that's going to be with the updates. So, once you have a solid policy and procedure, you can really just make those updates, once a year to make sure that everything is still reflective of the current practices that you are doing. Now, times change. People start working from home, and then that might mean that we have to develop a whole new policy and procedure. So like I said, this is a constant revolving, area that needs to be looked at. So with that, what do we do? How do we prioritize that? And I've given you 4 bullets on, different areas that, I personally believe help organizations prioritize their policies and procedures. One is just inventorying those policies. We might have a ton of policies, and really making sure that we understand what policies we currently have. And a lot of those are going to be probably some desktop procedures kind of shoved in. And then, when we look at that inventory, we can kind of see a gap. And so that brings me to the second one, which is our, a gap analysis. So, after you're able to inventory the policies and procedures that you have, and especially I'm going to focus this on, financial, I always think it's great to look at your balance sheet and income statement. And then go down and say, okay, do we have something for this area? Do we have something for this area? What's our most material area? Procurement probably is going to be a big one, right? So that's probably a high risk area, something that we need to look at right away. And then that brings me to points 3 and 4. So, after you're able to identify those gaps, either you go one way, which might be just to update those policies and procedures, make sure that they're in line with best practices and regulations, or another way, which is, policy procedure development. So coming in, developing comprehensive policies and procedures, making sure that they do align with best practices and recommendations, and then developing supporting forms, tools, and implementing that training that we discussed before. So with that said, polling question, which prioritization method would work best for your organization? My goodness, that was kind of a mouthful. So is it A, policy and procedure inventorying, B, P&P gap analysis, C, P&P updating, or is it D, policy and procedure development? So really getting, developing those comprehensive policies and procedures. And I have to say, I think it can almost go in sequence with prioritization, A down through D. Tammy, I know that you work a lot in policies and procedures as well, especially around personnel ones. What are you seeing in the personnel realm?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of updating for personnel, because most organizations have some personnel policies, but again, it falls into that this is the way we've always done it kind of category. And so there hasn't been a lot of emphasis over the last few years in rethinking those personnel policies and procedures, but now it's become a really critical time to do that, to help ensure that our employer can get the employees and support the employees that it needs to be successful.
I agree. Well, do you want to talk about some implementation guidelines?
I would love to. Yes. All right. So congratulations. Perhaps you have gone through the long and arduous process of inventorying and updating all of your policies and procedures. They're all up to date. So you're done, right? No, not right. Not really, as Chelsea had indicated. So your documented policies and procedures are really only as good as your ability to disseminate them across your organization so that employees understand the expectations and are held accountable to them. We've seen a number of clients go through this push, and then ultimately no one is aware of the guidance, which completely defeats the purpose of having these policies and procedures and dedicating the time to keeping them up to date. So these are some of the best practices that we have seen in effectively implementing new or revised policies and procedures. So yes, of course, you want to send the policy out. I would not expect someone to save it on their laptop for ongoing reference, though. And depending on the importance and variation that exists with that policy, we would recommend hosting a training on new processes or expectations for relevant stakeholders. So for example, if you have a new grants policy, then the program managers over grants need more than just an email with the policy attached. We should really have an actual training session on it. Ideally, that session would be live so that the program managers can ask questions and gain clarity, since it really will impact their work. We also would highly recommend having a central repository for all of your policies and procedures, regardless of what stage they're at. Employees need to be able to reference the materials over time because, again, they're not going to just download them into their laptop and have a a little spot on their own. And if they did, then it would probably be outdated policies and procedures. And ideally, that repository could be searchable. That helps provide a quick reference when you have to do something that you haven't done in a while to support consistency, compliance, and efficiency. Think about all the rework that ends up happening when someone didn't understand a process or wasn't aware of changes to a process. And all of that rework can be eliminated with the right type of upfront training and access to reference guides. And of course, the last element is accountability. New policies can represent change. And if we have communicated them out, provided some training, and a reference guide that can be accessed by anyone at any time, then employees are far more likely to comply with that new guidance. People might not get it right the first time, but that's an opportunity to reiterate the new policy rather than enable an exception and reversion to prior practices, which we have also often seen. Let's talk a little bit about maintenance. I saw in the comments there's some interest in understanding how do we keep the fire alive for policies and procedures. And really, when we're thinking about maintenance, there's a couple of key areas that we want to highlight that your policy and procedure development process is never over. As Chelsea mentioned, it's a circle, it's an evolution. And some of the triggers for a policy review is when a key process changes or a new system is implemented. We need to be documenting the way our processes have shifted to equip employees with the tools they need to do their work effectively. If neither of those things have happened, we recommend a biennial review of the policy, with the goal being to reduce the need for a complete overhaul that occurs when you neglect your policies and procedures for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, which we have seen. So those smaller changes over time will help keep your organization consistent, reduce the workload associated with keeping these up, and providing a big carafe of Starbucks coffee never hurts when you're going to have that biennial policy work session. But that's one way to sort of make sure that there's always emphasis on policies and procedures and that they're not just there for posterity's sake, that we're actually actively using them. And that concludes our presentation. I know there's some questions and we're very excited to answer some of those for you.
Yeah, I know we don't have a ton of time, but I was just looking through the question log, and a really common one that's coming up is sort of, how do you find a good balance between having something be high level versus super detailed, especially when we're thinking about procedure sections and actually keeping that up to date if they are super detailed? And I would say, at least in my area of work, the general approach that I have taken, and I'm curious to hear Chelsea and Tammy how you have handled this, but the general approach I've taken is that at the policy level, the expectation is that the policy probably can't cover every single instance that might ever come up. The goal is to set a policy that can help provide a guideline, an approach to how are we going to handle these types of problems. And then in the procedure section, obviously, that's where you can get much more detailed. And I would say for policies where you do expect and have the need for staff to be, for example, going through a very specific process in order to log information, get approvals, doing those types of things, I have found that more detail is really better, because then you're setting your folks up for success and they really live as current documents. But I'm curious, Chelsea and Tammy, on your side, what have you seen in relation to that kind of balance?
Annie Rose, I'm sort of going to answer your question and sort of not. But one thing that you made me think of was the creation of policies or procedures around one situation. And we want to discourage that. If we had one situation where an employee said they were working from home and they weren't working from home, well, then we have to change all of our organizational policies to deal with that one employee. And we really want to discourage that and use the policies to help support employees rather than being used as punitive tools. I just wanted to mention that as well. I don't know if Chelsea has any final thoughts before we turn it back over to Amy.
No, I think that's right on the money. Just making sure, your procedures reflect what your policies are saying, I think is my biggest, tip or word of advice. But this is a great conversation. I wish we could go longer, but I know that we need to send it over back to Amy.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Tammy, Chelsea, and Annie Rose for a really great presentation today. I also want to thank our audience for being engaged and submitting your questions to help guide today's conversation. If we didn't have time to answer yours, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Also, feel free to reach out to our presenters if you have additional questions. Their contact information is located in your console. And then also, if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And then also, for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. And we'll also be sending them via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast. And here are some insights and resources that we do have available on our website, so you can check those out via the PDF that you can download in the console. And then finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.